Gun trucks were never part of the official plan. They weren't issued through proper channels, they weren't standard military equipment, and they definitely weren't designed in some Pentagon office. But when convoys kept getting hammered in Vietnam with almost zero protection, soldiers started building their own defense systems right there in the combat zone. One of the major turning points came after a particularly savage ambush in 1967. We'll get to that story in a moment. First, it's critical understanding how things escalated to that breaking point. By late 1962, U.S. forces in Vietnam were scattered across remote bases, and the only way keeping them supplied was by road. Thousands of gallons of fuel, crates of ammunition, spare parts, food, water, everything had to move in massive convoys of trucks through terrain that was absolutely perfect for ambush operations. The roads were narrow, often unpaved, twisting through mountains and dense jungle. Names like Devil's Hairpin and Death Valley weren't exaggerations at all. There were blind curves every few hundred meters, thick foliage crowding right up to the roadside, and dozens of spots where a small enemy team could strike hard and vanish without leaving a trace. Convoys didn't roll with much protection at all. A few jeeps with mounted M60 machine guns might ride along, but there weren't enough armored vehicles to go around. Tanks and APCs were needed elsewhere, closer to active front lines. So, supply trucks were mostly left on their own, and these weren't even combat troops. Most people in those convoys were drivers. Their job was delivering fuel or gear, not fighting off coordinated attacks. But in Vietnam, there was no front line and absolutely no safe zone. That meant every supply run came with serious risk. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong understood that reality better than anyone. They learned exploiting weak points in convoy routes, waited patiently, and picked their moments with deadly precision. Mines, recoilless rifles, automatic fire. It only took a few minutes, wrecking an entire convoy before disappearing. Eventually, something had to change drastically. September 1967 brought one ambush that made it crystal clear drivers couldn't rely on backup, so they started creating their own protection. On the afternoon of September 2nd, 1967, a 39-vehicle convoy from the 8th Transportation Group left Pleiku heading back to the coastal city of Quy Nhon. They'd just finished delivering supplies to the 1st Cavalry Division earlier that day. The route back was supposed to be routine, but a 5,000-gallon fuel tanker at the rear was having serious trouble keeping pace, which created a gap about 500 meters wide between the front and rear sections. That made the whole convoy dangerously vulnerable. There were only 2 jeeps with M60s assigned for escort, and with the column split like that, they couldn't cover both ends effectively. The convoy commander knew this was a major problem, and just as he was thinking, this is not a good situation, a 57mm rocket slammed directly into the lead jeep. That was the ambush starting signal. Almost instantly, enemy fire erupted from the tree line along the road. AKs, RPGs, mines, recoilless rifles. About 29 trucks were caught in a 700-meter-long kill zone with no cover and limited weapons. The convoy was completely exposed to devastating fire. One of the biggest dangers was the fuel tanker at the rear. It took a direct hit and caught fire. Somehow, it didn't explode, but that was pure luck. Disabled vehicles started piling up fast. Some got taken out by recoilless rifles, others by mines that had been buried ahead of time and triggered remotely. The soldiers in the convoy tried returning fire, but they were seriously outgunned and spread way too thin. Most had little more than personal weapons, and whatever firepower the escort jeeps could offer. A company from the 1st Cavalry Division stationed less than a mile away mobilized quickly. They reached the site about 15 minutes after the ambush started, but by then the enemy had already melted into the jungle. The aftermath was absolutely brutal. 9 U.S. soldiers eliminated, 17 wounded, and nearly 30 vehicles destroyed or left behind. There was no mistaking what this meant. The enemy had figured out hitting convoys hard, fast, and without getting caught. And unless something changed dramatically, it was going to keep happening. From that point forward, supply crews started doing what the Army hadn't, arming and protecting their trucks themselves. After the Pleiku ambush, nobody in transport units expected help arriving in time, so they stopped waiting for it. The first step was figuring out how to add some real protection. Most cargo trucks were 2.5-ton M35S basic haulers with zero armor. Crews started by lining truck beds with sandbags and sheets of plywood. It was better than nothing, but not by much. The sandbags got soaked in rain, turned into dead weight, and overloaded the suspension. Trucks became harder to steer, slower to brake, and sometimes the extra weight even snapped axles. The next idea was welding on steel plates actual armor. Problem was, steel wasn't easy coming by, so crews got incredibly creative. If another unit had spare material lying around, it might go missing overnight. Sometimes it wasn't even spare, it was just taken. Nobody really asked questions if it meant surviving the next convoy run. That was enough justification. They started building what became known as the gun box. 4 steel walls welded around the cargo bed high enough, giving cover to the gunner. Inside, some designs added a second layer of steel with a gap between them, which helped reducing damage from explosives and armor-piercing rounds. The engine bay, fuel tank, and cab floor were also reinforced, giving the driver at least some protection against mines. Eventually, the heavier M54 5-ton trucks became the preferred platform. They could handle more weight and more firepower without falling apart. The M51 dump trucks were also used. Then someone had an idea that looked absolutely ridiculous but actually worked. They mounted the armored hull of a damaged M113 APC onto the back of a truck. They stripped out the engine and tracks, just kept the armored shell and bolted it down. It gave the crew better protection and a solid platform for mounting weapons, but it wasn't perfect. The added weight made the truck top-heavy, and it handled poorly, especially on rough terrain or sharp turns. Still, in a firefight, the trade-off was absolutely worth it. As for the weapons, those kept evolving constantly. It started with M60S on a pivoting mount enough to return fire. But soon crews were adding 50 caliber machine guns. Some trucks had 2 or 3 of them. Others went even further, installing the M45 quad mount originally used for anti-aircraft defense. It held 50 cals and could fire around 2,000 rounds per minute. When that thing opened up during an ambush, it shut down everything in front of it instantly. Some crews mounted M134 miniguns. One famous truck called Eve of Destruction had a hand-cranked version, no electric motor, like old Gatling guns from the 1800s. It looked strange, but it worked perfectly. The trucks carried massive amounts of ammunition, thousands of rounds for each weapon. They also had grenade launchers, light anti-tank weapons, and stacks of hand grenades. On top of that, many crews brought older weapons they trusted more than standard-issue rifles. World War II-era Thompson submachine guns, M1 Garand's even captured AK-47 seconds. Crews gave their trucks unique and creative names like the Untouchable, Brutus, the Misfits, Eve of Destruction. These were built by hand, and the crews trusted them with their lives. If you want hearing more stories like this or seeing a full video where we go deep into the complete story of gun trucks, feel free to subscribe. There's way more coming soon.